Marcus Johnson stepped off the double-decker bus in front of Buckingham Palace with his backpack slung over one shoulder and his phone already in his hand. The 24-year-old college student from Ohio had been planning this trip to London for over a year. He had worked 2 part-time jobs and saved every penny he could just to afford this vacation. This was his first time visiting England, and he was determined to make the most of every single moment. The morning sun was shining brightly on the golden gates of the palace. Marcus looked around in amazement at the grand building that housed the British royal family. Tourists were everywhere taking photos and chatting excitedly in different languages. Street vendors were selling postcards and souvenirs nearby. The whole scene felt magical to Marcus, who had only seen places like this in movies and documentaries back home in Columbus. Marcus pulled out his phone and started taking selfies with the palace in the background. He wanted to show his friends and family back home all the amazing places he was visiting. As he scrolled through his social media feeds, he noticed that his posts were not getting as many likes and comments as he had hoped. He felt a little disappointed because he really wanted to impress everyone with his London adventure. That was when Marcus spotted something that made his eyes light up with excitement. Standing perfectly still near the palace entrance was one of the famous Queen's guards. The guard was wearing the traditional bright red uniform, with shiny golden buttons running down the front. On his head sat the iconic tall black hat made of real bearskin that made him look almost 7 feet tall. In his hands he held a rifle, and his face showed absolutely no expression at all. Marcus had heard stories about these guards from other travelers. People said they never moved or spoke, no matter what tourists did around them. He had watched YouTube videos of people trying to make the guards laugh or react, but the soldiers always stayed perfectly still like living statues. Marcus thought this would be the perfect opportunity to create some viral content for his social media accounts. He approached the guard slowly while holding up his phone to record. The guard was a man named Sergeant William Hayes, who had been serving in this position for 8 long years. Hayes had joined the military when he was 18 years old and had worked his way up through dedication and hard training. Protecting the royal family was not just his job, it was his calling, and he took it very seriously. Marcus did not know any of this background information about the guard. To him, the man in the red uniform was simply a tourist attraction. He had no idea that Sergeant Hayes had undergone months of intense training to earn his position. He did not realize that the guard had sworn a sacred oath to protect the monarchy with his life, if necessary. The young tourist from Ohio started his recording and began making faces at the camera while standing next to the motionless guard. He smiled widely and gave thumbs-up signs while speaking to his phone. Other tourists walking by started to notice what Marcus was doing. Some of them stopped to watch, and a few even started taking their own photos and videos of the scene. Marcus felt encouraged by the attention he was getting. This was exactly what he had been hoping for. He thought he was being clever and entertaining. He had no idea that he was about to learn one of the most important lessons of his entire life about respect, tradition, and the serious consequences that come from treating sacred duties like a joke for social media entertainment. Marcus held his phone steady and started recording himself making silly faces next to Sergeant Hayes. He stuck out his tongue and crossed his eyes while grinning at the camera. The guard remained completely motionless with his eyes staring straight ahead into the distance. His face showed no reaction at all to Marcus standing right beside him making funny expressions. The young tourist felt excited that his plan was working. He thought the contrast between his goofy behavior and the guard's serious stillness would make for great social media content. Marcus moved closer to the guard and started making even more exaggerated facial expressions. He puffed out his cheeks and made duck faces while recording continuous video on his phone. A small group of other tourists began to gather around to watch what Marcus was doing. There was an elderly couple from Germany who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. A family from Australia with 2 young children stopped to see what was happening. The kids pointed at Marcus and giggled at his silly behavior, while their parents watched with worried expressions on their faces. Marcus noticed the growing audience and felt even more confident about his performance. He thought he was entertaining people and creating the kind of viral moment that would get thousands of views online. He started talking to his phone camera in a loud voice so everyone could hear him clearly. He pointed at Sergeant Hayes and said, "This guard is wearing such a funny costume. Look at that huge hat on his head. I bet it weighs more than a bowling ball." Marcus laughed at his own joke and looked around to see if other people were laughing too. Some tourists smiled nervously, but others looked away feeling embarrassed by his behavior. The guard stood perfectly still during all of this. Sergeant Hayes had been trained to ignore distractions and maintain his position no matter what happened around him. He had dealt with countless tourists over the years who tried to get reactions from him. Some people made jokes while others tried to startle him with loud noises. Hayes had learned to block out everything and focus only on his duty to protect the palace. But inside his mind, Hayes was beginning to feel frustrated with this particular tourist. The young man was being louder and more disrespectful than most visitors. Hayes could hear every word Marcus was saying about his uniform and his appearance. The guard took great pride in wearing the traditional red coat that represented centuries of British military history. Marcus continued his performance by pretending to march like a soldier. He lifted his knees high and swung his arms while walking in circles around the guard. He made exaggerated, serious faces and tried to copy the guard's perfect posture. The crowd of watching tourists grew larger as more people stopped to see what was causing all the commotion. A tour guide leading a group of Japanese visitors tried to move her group away from the scene. She could sense that the situation was becoming inappropriate and did not want her tourists to be involved in any problems. She had seen situations like this before and knew they could escalate quickly if not handled properly. Marcus was having too much fun to notice the concerned looks from experienced travelers. He was completely focused on his phone screen and the reactions he was getting from some of the younger tourists who were laughing at his antics. He had no idea that his harmless fun was actually crossing lines of respect and protocol that had serious consequences in this place of royal tradition and military discipline. Marcus was getting bolder with each passing minute. The small crowd that had gathered around him was giving him the confidence to push his performance even further. He wanted to create something truly memorable that would get him the viral fame he was seeking. The attention from other tourists made him feel like a celebrity, and he did not want the moment to end. He started shouting at Sergeant Hayes in a mocking voice. "Hey there, statue man, can you hear me in there? Are you even a real person, or just a fancy robot?" Marcus laughed loudly at his own jokes and looked around to see if others were laughing with him. Some younger tourists chuckled nervously, while older visitors shook their heads in disapproval. The guard remained perfectly still, but his training was being tested like never before. Sergeant Hayes had endured many difficult situations during his 8 years of service, but this tourist was being particularly disrespectful. Hayes focused on his breathing and reminded himself of his oath to remain disciplined, no matter what distractions occurred around him. Marcus decided to take his performance to the next level. He began making crude jokes about the Queen and the royal family, while pointing at the palace behind him. He said things that would have shocked his own mother back home in Ohio. The words came out of his mouth without him thinking about the consequences or the people who might be offended by his comments. Several tourists in the crowd looked genuinely upset by what Marcus was saying. An elderly British couple walked away quickly with disgusted expressions on their faces. A group of school children on a field trip were quickly moved along by their teacher, who did not want them to hear such disrespectful language about their monarch. But Marcus was too caught up in his performance to notice the negative reactions around him. He was focused only on his phone screen and the video he was recording. He thought he was being funny and entertaining when in reality, he was crossing serious lines of respect and decency. Then Marcus made the biggest mistake of his entire trip to London. He reached out his hand toward Sergeant Hayes and touched the guard's rifle. It was just a quick touch with his fingertips, but the moment his skin made contact with the weapon, everything changed in an instant. The rifle that Sergeant Hayes carried was not a toy or a prop. It was a real military weapon that was part of his official duty to protect the royal family. The rifle represented the serious nature of his job, and the authority he held as a member of the Queen's Guard. No unauthorized person was ever allowed to touch a guard's weapon under any circumstances. The moment Marcus's fingers touched the rifle, several things happened at once. Other guards stationed around the palace area immediately took notice of what had occurred. They began moving into position following security protocols that had been drilled into them hundreds of times during their training. Sergeant Hayes felt the unauthorized contact with his weapon, and his entire body tensed with controlled anger. His jaw tightened, and his grip on the rifle adjusted slightly. Years of military discipline kept him from reacting immediately, but inside he was preparing for what needed to happen next. Marcus was completely unaware that he had just committed a serious security violation. He continued laughing and talking to his phone camera, not realizing that he had crossed a line that would have consequences he never could have imagined. For several long seconds after Marcus touched the rifle, everything seemed normal on the surface. Marcus continued recording himself and making jokes while the crowd of tourists kept watching his performance. The morning sun was still shining brightly, and the sounds of London traffic continued in the background, as if nothing had changed at all. But people who understood royal protocol and military procedure began to notice subtle changes happening around them. The atmosphere had shifted in ways that most casual tourists could not detect. It was like the calm that happens right before a powerful storm breaks over the landscape. Sergeant Hayes remained in his official position, but experienced observers could see small differences in his posture and breathing. His shoulders had become slightly more tense, and his grip on the rifle had adjusted in a way that showed increased alertness. His eyes were still staring straight ahead, but there was a new intensity in his gaze that had not been there before. Other guards stationed at different points around the palace began making almost invisible movements. They shifted their weight from one foot to the other and adjusted their positions by just a few inches. To untrained eyes, these movements looked like nothing more than normal adjustments that anyone might make while standing for long periods of time. But these guards were following procedures that had been practiced countless times in training. They were preparing for a situation that required immediate coordinated response. Each guard knew exactly what his role would be if the situation escalated further. They were like a well-oiled machine getting ready to spring into action. Marcus was completely blind to all of these warning signs. He was too focused on his phone and the entertainment he thought he was providing to the growing crowd of onlookers. He made another joke about the guard being a living statue and pretended to dust off Sergeant Hayes' uniform with his hand. The tourists watching had mixed reactions to what they were seeing. Some people were still laughing and taking their own photos and videos of Marcus' performance. Others were beginning to feel uncomfortable with how far the young man was pushing his behavior. A few experienced travelers started moving away from the area, sensing that trouble might be coming. An older gentleman who had served in the British military many years ago recognized the signs of what was about to happen. He tried to get the attention of his wife so they could leave the area quickly. He had seen military discipline in action before and knew that when it was unleashed it could be shocking to civilians who were not prepared for it. A group of American tourists who had been enjoying Marcus' antics suddenly noticed that other people around them were looking nervous. They could not understand why the mood seemed to be changing when everything still appeared normal on the surface. The young man from Ohio was still making jokes, and the guard was still standing perfectly still. But the tension in the air was building like pressure in a steam engine. Everyone present was about to witness something that would demonstrate the true nature of the Queen's Guard and the serious consequences that come from disrespecting the symbols and traditions of the British monarchy. Sergeant Hayes was reaching the limit of his patience and professional restraint. Years of training had taught him exactly how to handle situations like this one. The protocols were clear, and the response would be swift, decisive, and absolutely unforgettable for everyone who witnessed it. The storm was about to break, and Marcus Johnson from Ohio was about to learn the most important lesson of his young life about respect, authority, and the difference between harmless fun and serious misconduct. Without any warning at all, Sergeant Hayes suddenly exploded into motion with a speed and power that shocked everyone within 50 feet of where he stood. The transformation was so dramatic and unexpected that it seemed like magic had brought a statue to life in the most frightening way possible. The guard spun toward Marcus with military precision that came from years of intensive training. His entire body moved as one coordinated unit, turning to face the young tourist who had pushed too far beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The movement was so sharp and sudden that several people in the crowd jumped backward in surprise. "Steve Basic from the Queen's Guard," roared Sergeant Hayes in a voice that seemed to shake the very walls of Buckingham Palace. The sound was louder than Marcus had ever heard a human voice become. It was like thunder crashing directly overhead during the worst storm imaginable. The words carried across the courtyard and echoed off the stone buildings surrounding the area. Marcus dropped his phone immediately, as if it had suddenly become too hot to hold. The device clattered onto the pavement, and the screen cracked when it hit the stone ground. His face went completely white with shock, and his mouth fell open wide enough to catch flies. He had never experienced anything like this moment in his entire life. The guard's voice carried the weight of centuries of British military tradition and royal protection. It was not just one man shouting, it was the voice of every soldier who had ever stood guard over the monarchy throughout history. The sound contained authority that came from deep within the core of military discipline and duty. Marcus stumbled backward several steps, as if he had been physically pushed by an invisible force. His legs felt weak, and his hands started shaking uncontrollably. The confident young man who had been entertaining tourists just seconds before was now trembling like a child who had been caught doing something terribly wrong. The crowd of tourists gasped collectively at the sudden explosion of sound and movement. Some people screamed in surprise while others stood frozen in place, not knowing what to do or where to look. Children began crying and parents quickly pulled them closer for protection and comfort. Several tourists started recording the scene with their own phones, realizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary that would be talked about for years to come. The videos they captured would later spread across social media, showing the world what happens when someone disrespects the Queen's Guard. An elderly woman near the back of the crowd grabbed her husband's arm so tightly that she left marks on his skin. She had never seen such a display of military authority in her 70 years of life. The power in the guard's voice made her remember stories her grandfather had told about soldiers during wartime. Marcus realized in that single terrifying moment that he had made a mistake bigger than anything he could have imagined. This was not a costumed actor or a tourist attraction standing before him. This was a highly trained soldier whose job was to protect the royal family, and he took that responsibility more seriously than life itself. The guard's face had transformed from blank expressionless calm to fierce determination and authority. His eyes were now focused directly on Marcus, with an intensity that made the young tourist feel like he was being examined by a laser beam. There was no anger in the guard's expression, only the cold professional discipline of a man who would do whatever was necessary to maintain order and respect. Marcus understood for the first time that he was not dealing with entertainment or a game. He was face to face with real military power and tradition that demanded respect and would not tolerate disrespect under any circumstances whatsoever. What happened next showed the world the true meaning of military professionalism and discipline. Sergeant Hayes did not lose control of his emotions or become violent like an ordinary person might have done. Instead, he delivered a lesson in respect and authority that was both educational and absolutely intimidating to everyone who witnessed it. "You will show proper respect to the crown and its guards," declared Sergeant Hayes in a voice that carried clearly across the entire courtyard area. His words were spoken with perfect clarity and controlled power that made every syllable sound like a command from the highest levels of authority. "This is not a game, and we are not here for your entertainment." The guard's training was evident in every word he spoke and every movement he made. He had been taught exactly how to handle situations like this one, and his response was textbook perfect. There was no personal anger or emotion in his voice, only the cold professional authority of a soldier carrying out his sworn duty. Other guards stationed around the palace quickly moved into position, creating a protective formation that demonstrated their serious military training and coordination. They moved with the same precision and discipline as their colleague, showing that this was not just one man's reaction, but the coordinated response of an entire security system. Marcus found himself surrounded by professional soldiers who were making it very clear that his behavior was completely unacceptable and would not be tolerated under any circumstances. The guards formed a circle around him, not in a threatening way, but in a manner that showed their complete control over the situation. The lead guard continued his lecture in terms that everyone present could understand perfectly. Touching a guard's weapon is considered a security threat to the royal family, he explained. Such actions can result in immediate arrest and prosecution under British law. You are fortunate that your behavior appears to be based on ignorance rather than malicious intent. Marcus's face turned bright red with embarrassment as he realized that dozens of people were now staring at him and recording his humiliation on their own phones and cameras. The tables had completely turned from his original plan. Instead of being the entertainer creating viral content, he had become the subject of a very public lesson in respect and proper behavior. The crowd of tourists watched in fascination as they witnessed a masterclass in military discipline and authority. Many people had never seen anything like this before, and they were amazed by the professionalism and control shown by the guards. Some visitors later said it was the most impressive display of military bearing they had ever witnessed. Children in the crowd stopped crying and started watching with wide eyes as they saw real soldiers in action. Parents used the moment as a teaching opportunity, explaining to their children about the importance of showing respect for authority and following rules when visiting important places. A group of British tourists approached other visitors to explain the significance of what they had just witnessed. They helped foreign visitors understand that the Queen's Guard are not performers or actors, but real soldiers with serious responsibilities, and that touching their weapons or equipment is never acceptable under any circumstances. Marcus stood in the center of the circle of guards, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his entire life. The confident young man who had started recording just minutes earlier was now a humbled and embarrassed tourist who finally understood the serious nature of what he had done. The guard's response had been perfectly calibrated to teach a lesson without causing harm. It was a demonstration of how true professionals handle difficult situations with authority, control, and dignity, while maintaining the respect and traditions they are sworn to protect. Within just a few minutes of the confrontation, palace security officers arrived on the scene to assess what had happened and determine if any further action needed to be taken. They were dressed in plain clothes but moved with the same professional authority as the guards who had handled the initial situation with Marcus. The security team quickly took control of the area and began questioning Marcus about his intentions and background. They wanted to make sure he was just a foolish tourist rather than someone with more serious motives for touching the guard's weapon. Their questions were thorough but professional as they tried to understand exactly what had led to the incident. Marcus answered their questions, honestly explaining that he was just a college student from Ohio who had wanted to create entertaining social media content. He admitted that he had not understood the seriousness of his actions and apologized repeatedly for his behavior. The security officers could see that he was genuinely embarrassed and remorseful rather than defiant or hostile. His phone was temporarily taken away while security reviewed the recordings he had made to ensure that nothing sensitive or inappropriate had been captured on video. They needed to make sure that no security procedures or guard positions had been compromised by his filming activities around the palace area. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation began to slowly disperse as the excitement died down. Many people continued talking about what they had witnessed, and several tourists approached Sergeant Hayes afterward to apologize for their fellow visitors' disrespectful behavior toward him and his position. Some visitors thanked the guard for maintaining the dignity and traditions of the royal family. They told him that they appreciated his professionalism and the way he had handled such a difficult situation. The guard accepted their comments with quiet dignity, but remained focused on returning to his official duties. A group of school children who had witnessed the incident were gathered by their teacher for an impromptu lesson about respect and proper behavior when visiting important cultural sites. The teacher used what they had just seen as an example of why it is important to follow rules and show respect for authority figures. Marcus was eventually released by security with a formal written warning about his conduct and a clear explanation of the consequences if similar behavior occurred again in the future. He was also banned from returning to any royal property, including Buckingham Palace, for a period of 6 months. As he walked away from the palace, Marcus could hear other tourists continuing to discuss what they had witnessed. Many people expressed support for the guard's response and criticized tourists who failed to show proper respect when visiting culturally significant locations around the world. The incident had become a learning experience not just for Marcus but for everyone who had been present to witness it. People talked about the importance of understanding local customs and traditions before visiting foreign countries and tourist attractions. Several tour guides in the area began using the incident as an example in their presentations to visitors about appropriate behavior when visiting royal sites and other important British institutions. They explained that the guards are real soldiers with serious responsibilities rather than entertainers or photo opportunities. Marcus picked up his cracked phone from the pavement where he had dropped it during the confrontation. The broken screen seemed like a fitting symbol for how his plans for viral social media fame had completely fallen apart. He realized that his quest for online attention had taught him lessons he never could have learned in any classroom back home. The aftermath of the incident continued to ripple through the crowd long after Marcus had left the area, showing how one person's poor judgment can affect many other people and create lasting memories for everyone involved. Marcus did get his viral moment, but it came in a way he had never wanted or expected. Within hours of the incident, videos of his confrontation with Sergeant Hayes began spreading rapidly across every major social media platform. The footage had been recorded by dozens of tourists who had witnessed the event, and they were all eager to share what they had seen. The videos showed Marcus being humiliated and taught a lesson rather than being funny and entertaining as he had originally planned. Instead of making him famous for being clever and amusing, he became known around the world as an example of what not to do when visiting important cultural sites and monuments. Comments on the videos were overwhelmingly critical of Marcus's behavior and supportive of the guard's professional response to the situation. People from dozens of different countries expressed their opinions about tourist etiquette and the importance of showing respect for local traditions and customs when traveling abroad. Many viewers shared their own stories of witnessing disrespectful tourist behavior in their home countries and praised the professionalism shown by the Queen's Guard in handling such a difficult situation. They said it was refreshing to see someone in authority take a firm stand against inappropriate behavior rather than simply ignoring it. The incident became the subject of news articles and blog posts about tourist behavior and cultural sensitivity. Travel websites began using Marcus's story as a cautionary tale about the importance of researching local customs and showing appropriate respect when visiting significant historical and cultural locations. Marcus found himself reading comments from people all over the world who were discussing his behavior and the lessons that could be learned from his experience. Most of the comments were not mean-spirited, but they were definitely critical of his actions and supportive of the consequences he had faced. Several travel guides and cultural education programs began using the video as a teaching tool to help prepare tourists for appropriate behavior when visiting foreign countries. They showed how quickly a fun vacation moment can turn into an embarrassing international incident if proper respect is not shown. The story was picked up by news outlets in both Britain and the United States, with reporters interviewing experts about tourist behavior and the role of royal guards in protecting British traditions. The coverage was generally balanced, but it clearly showed that public opinion supported the guards' response rather than Marcus's behavior. Marcus's 15 minutes of fame came with a heavy dose of public embarrassment and a permanent record on the internet that would follow him for years to come. Every time someone searched for his name, they would find videos and articles about his confrontation with the royal guard. He began receiving messages from people around the world, some offering support and understanding, while others continued to criticize his actions. The attention forced him to think deeply about his behavior and the impact that social media can have on both the people who create content and those who are affected by it. Friends and family back home in Ohio saw the videos and had mixed reactions. Some were embarrassed by his behavior, while others felt sorry for him because of all the negative attention he was receiving. His parents were disappointed but supportive as they helped him deal with the unexpected consequences of his actions. The incident became a case study in how quickly things can go wrong when people prioritize social media content over respect and common sense. It showed that the internet never forgets and that moments of poor judgment can have lasting consequences that extend far beyond the original situation. Marcus realized that his quest for viral fame had succeeded, but in the worst possible way. He had learned the hard way that there is a big difference between positive attention and negative notoriety. 6 months later, Marcus returned to his home in Columbus, Ohio, with a completely different perspective on travel, cultural respect, and the power of social media. The experience at Buckingham Palace had changed him in ways that he was still discovering and understanding as time passed by. He had spent the remaining days of his London trip reflecting on what had happened and visiting other historic sites with a much more respectful and thoughtful approach. He read about the history and significance of each place before visiting and made sure to follow all rules and guidelines carefully. Back at Ohio State University, Marcus began using his experience to educate other students about responsible tourism and the importance of understanding local customs before traveling to foreign countries. He spoke at student organizations and travel clubs about his mistakes and the lessons he had learned from them. His story became part of the curriculum in several international studies and cultural awareness courses at the university. Professors used his experience as a real-world example of how cultural misunderstandings can occur and why preparation and respect are so important when traveling abroad. Marcus started a blog called Respectful Traveler, where he wrote about his experiences and encouraged others to research and respect the places they visit. He interviewed other travelers who had learned similar lessons about cultural sensitivity and shared their stories to help prevent others from making the same mistakes. The blog became popular among young travelers who appreciated hearing from someone who had made real mistakes and learned from them rather than just reading generic travel advice. Marcus's honest approach to discussing his failures resonated with readers who were planning their own international adventures. He eventually wrote a detailed post apologizing for his behavior at Buckingham Palace and explaining how the experience had taught him about humility, respect, and the real people behind the uniforms and traditions that tourists often take for granted. The post was shared thousands of times and helped repair some of the damage to his reputation. Meanwhile, Sergeant Hayes continued his duties with the same dedication and professionalism he had always shown. The incident with Marcus became part of the training scenarios used to prepare new guards for handling disruptive visitors and inappropriate tourist behavior. The video of their confrontation continued to be shared and discussed on social media, serving as an ongoing reminder of the importance of respecting cultural institutions and the people who dedicate their lives to preserving traditions and maintaining security. Other guards at royal locations around Britain reported that tourist behavior had generally improved in the months following the incident. Many visitors seemed more aware of appropriate conduct and showed greater respect for the guards in their duties. Travel insurance companies began including information about cultural sensitivity and appropriate tourist behavior in their educational materials. They used Marcus's story as an example of how poor behavior abroad can lead to legal troubles and other serious consequences for travelers. The incident served as a lasting reminder that behind every tradition, uniform, and ceremony are real people who deserve respect and dignity. It showed that the pursuit of social media fame should never come at the expense of cultural sensitivity and basic human decency. Marcus learned that true viral success comes from creating content that brings people together and spreads positivity rather than content that disrespects others or violates important cultural boundaries. His experience became a powerful lesson about the responsibility that comes with having a platform to reach and influence other people. Years later, both Marcus and Sergeant Hayes would remember that day as a moment when respect, tradition, and human dignity were upheld in the face of disrespectful behavior. The incident proved that some things are more important than entertainment, and that true strength comes from maintaining dignity and professionalism even in difficult situations.